You started a really cool company, Arcion. You've been involved in many different companies at varying stages throughout your career. From my understanding of Arcion, you are collecting the data feeds that companies gather to improve the cycle time for in-house data engineers to generate reports. So previous to Arcion, people would be really slow to be able to generate reports pulling from the database. And tell me where I'm wrong, or tell me how you articulate that more clearly.
To that. So you're right. In the past, the basic world that I lived in, so I spent the past 10 years or so building applications for people in banks or insurance companies or government agencies or others to have these really comprehensive AI machine learning sorts of things, right? Applications or whatever they were building. And the epiphany for all of these folks was the fact that they all wanted to have applications that were basically being fed data in real time. And the data for most of them would, by the way, come out of their production systems, right? So their ATM network or the credit card network or whatever it was, right? But the challenge was all the IT people would never really allow them access into those production systems for a variety of reasons, right? Security concerns or performance of those systems, or, the list went on, right? And so we would sell them these big expensive applications that would really only refresh weekly or monthly. And they would often break, right? Because it would be these queries that would be done in the middle of the night, and somebody would wind up changing things, and all kinds of things would go on from there. And so that was the world that I was used to. And what Arcion does is kind of what you suggested, but it's a slight nuance, and that is we allow people to gain access to real-time transactions coming out of those operational data stores. And we do it not by accessing the data stores, but by accessing the logs that sit next to the data store, because every time you write into the data store, something gets written into the log. And so we've created a technology that allows you to read that stuff and then move it into whatever consumption application or platform you want to build your machine learning or other things into, right? So pretty close to what you said, but the real nuance here is we don't do stuff that's already streaming, because there's people that do that, and it's kind of easy, right? What we focus in on are the hard things that people really have had a hard time getting access to, but find very valuable, right?
Is the hard part, when you reference the easy versus hard part, the hard part is, are you duplicating the data so the data goes into the database that the company is using, but then it's also going into your database?
Yeah, so we don't actually have a database. So what we are is essentially a transport vehicle, if you want to think about it as that. And so yes, there's two modes, right? So there's a mode one, which is what's called a migration sort of mode, right? So I have Oracle and I want to move it to, whatever, a Postgres sort of system, right? And so what you're doing there is, normally people don't just hot cut over and say, adios to Oracle, and let me go and start building on this new data set. That'd be pretty career suicidal for a lot of people, right? So what in fact happens is people they stream data from the original system that they want to migrate from into the system they want to migrate to, and then they test it and they work with it and they build new stuff on it and they just make sure that it's up and running and that sort of stuff. And it usually takes 6 months, 9 months, whatever, depending on what the protocols are, right? So that's mode number one. Mode number two is what I would describe as replication mode, right? And so that's the predominant use case that happens today. And in that one, what happens is let's go back to Oracle, right? We're taking things out of Oracle and we're formatting them in the way that it can be consumed on, let's say, Snowflake or Databricks or whatever system you want to be that's offline, that will build the analysis or the machine learning or the other things that will then feed into, something that somebody within that organization uses to make a decision or to base actions on or other things like that, right? So, but we don't actually store the data. All we do is we basically figure out what the data is, right? How it translates into the system that it's going into, so that the people in that other system can then use it in a native format, right? Does that make sense? Okay.
I think so. So are there two different applications? One is a company is migrating their database over from, right, in the case, Oracle to Postgres. And then the second application is a company's just running and they want to be able to access the data in the database.
Yeah.
Those are two distinct scenarios.
So the first one is pretty straightforward. I want to move stuff out of this and I move it into that. So we probably don't need to dwell on that one. The replicate one is the one where, almost all companies will have some sort of a data warehouse, right? So Snowflake's a really popular one today. Great for BI, great for doing a bunch of things that allow people to kind of see, what's happening in their world. But there's a whole bunch of new data warehouses that are showing up. Like Databricks is another one that's come up in the last couple of years. And that's one where it's great for doing machine learning, right? People are going to then take data out of whatever transactional system they have and dump it into that system so they can start doing real cool and interesting machine learning or AI bits on it. There's these other platforms that I would describe as what are called fast OLAP or fast data warehouses that are really designed to like ingest things super quickly so that you can then build applications that, let's say you're on the phone with a customer service agent, right? And by virtue of the fact that you're getting information out of the transactional store, that customer service agent is able to much quicker say, oh, hey, I see you've, selected product X. Most of the people that select X, they really like Y too, right? So, that could be an example, or you could do it for fraud sorts of things or whatever else. So there's all these things that will sit on a data warehouse. Because the data warehouse is the place to do all these things. You never want to do any of those things on a transactional system because you'll slow them down, or there could be all the reasons why you just don't do this on a transactional system. You need to get the data out of there though, and that's kind of what we do.
So would Segment be a competitor?
Not really. No, not
the company
really.
Segment.
Segment is would be something that we could use to put data into, right? But no, it wouldn't necessarily be. What our special sauce really is the ability to actually grab that information out of data stores that are usually very heterogeneous or very uniquely constructed. So think about it this way, right? If you're working in most what I would describe as modern SaaS applications today, you don't have to figure out the data model or the schema or other things. There's one way you're going to get it, right? And it's relatively straightforward. They're usually designed to be kind of event-based or fast, right? Where they're just going to give you the things out of it. Mm-hmm. But think about all the things that are built on, let's say, SAP or Oracle or, all these other things, right? The number of applications or customizations that people have built into those databases and the things that sit on top of them is pretty enormous, right? And so that's the thing that we specialize in, which is understanding the rules that people have applied to the applications that they built on top of those data stores and being able to translate those into a format that you can then understand in the data warehouse. Right. And so that's the real essence of the hard stuff. The segment would basically be a place where you would stream that stuff into, and then you could decide where it disseminates out to. Right. But you still have to get the data out, which is what we do.
Yeah. No, I remember using Segment and having a mind-numbing time connecting it.
That's the issue.
Is Arcion specifically useful for older databases or older companies that have less standardized or less modern backend frameworks?
So not really, although in all candor, it's probably the place where we have the greatest value because look, here's the deal. Right. So Oracle is still 40% of the database market today, right? And it's slow. It's slowing down
crazy.
A little bit, but it's not going anywhere anytime soon. And the reason why is because, like, if you're somebody who runs, a production database of some sort, right, and the thing that you've built it for has been working and it's been working for 10 years, you're not just going to wake up one day and say, like, well, let's just chuck that out and go move this other thing over here, right? That's like, hey, look, we got other priorities to go figure out, right? And so those things tend to run for a very long period of time until you go back and totally re-architect the thing that you've done on it. And then you wind up in a modern data store. So that's the place where we have the most value because those are the hardest things. And by the way, the other reason why it's very valuable is like the number of people who are trained on how to do Oracle or whatever else is kind of dwindling. Everybody wants to like go off and do Postgres or Mongo work or other stuff like that, right? Whereas the pool of people who really know how to architect and do stuff in Oracle is kind of, it's not growing, right? So that's one aspect. But so we are able to do the same sorts of things out of other places that people have built complex things. And as an example of that, Snowflake's a good example of that, right? So we have the ability to use Snowflake as a source as well. And you might be saying, well, that seems like a modern data store and all that sort of stuff. But the interesting thing is a lot of the same attributes of what make Oracle somewhat more difficult to interact with are kind of showing up in the Snowflake world as well, right? People have built a whole bunch of crazy things on it, right? It's not the easiest to get things out of because Snowflake, basically, the more they lock in, people into it or make it difficult to get stuff out, the less likely they are to do it, and a variety of those other sorts of things. And so the end goal for us as a company at the end of the day is to basically allow people to get access to data. I call it kind of like data as a service at the end of the day, irrespective of where it lives, right? It really, like if you're building a machine learning application and you want to build it on, let's say, Databricks, you shouldn't have to care if it's sitting in Snowflake, that source data is sitting in Snowflake or Oracle or some mainframe locked in, whatever, right? You should be able to, if you have the proper permissions and rights, you should be able to get at that data and do what you need to do with the data, right? That's all there is to it. And so that's really the goal of what we're trying to build here.
What do you think the situation is with Oracle? So they have a huge market share still today. They seem to be, like you said, dropping in market share. People are less interested in the technology. Did they misplay their hand in some way strategically, or is that just the inevitable churn of technology and iterative databases? Like it seems like other companies don't seem to fall in the wayside as much.
Well,
what's your take?
If you want to talk about track records of success over the course of 20, 30 years or whatever else, Oracle gets put on any billboard out there, right? They've done a masterful job of staying relevant and staying connected and buying stuff that keeps them in the game. And, they've got a bunch of interesting things that, that they picked up through acquisitions or other things over time, right? But I think what you're seeing is more the latter, not that Oracle necessarily misplayed anything, but the fact is, I can't even count how many billions of dollars have gone into startups with cool and interesting new, database replacement technologies that are basically designed to be like, this one's going to kill Oracle, right? And so there's a bunch of interesting things that have shown up. And what it's really done is it's allowed a more democratized set of tools to select. It allows you, like the old world was, you didn't have a lot of options. You're like, I can go to Oracle or I can go to SAP or whatever. And that was it, right? But today, right, there's all these other options, and you can go off and figure out, for this thing that I want to build, Postgres is a great solution, or Mongo is a great solution, or whatever, right? So you have this whole panoply of things that you can pull from, right? And by the way, that also stitches into the theory that we have as a company, which is like applications or things should be architected on the platform that best suits their design, right? You shouldn't have to force yourself into using one particular database or platform or whatever, simply because, that's just what we do around here. We think people should be free to build whatever they need, whenever they need to, wherever they need to build it, right? So.
Yeah, which, makes a lot of sense. I guess what would be the alternate view? Do people say that, hey, we should all be forced into one database, or is there a significant opposing viewpoint, or is that? It seems like kind of consensus. I guess to build
so
where
the
you are.
epiphany here is there's consensus in terms of what sounds right, and then there's the practical reality of actually executing and that sort of thing, right? So I think, other than maybe North Korean DBAs or whatever else, right? Everybody's going to kind of agree that, hey, if I want to use Mongo, I should be able to use Mongo, right? Or whatever the case is, right? And so,
right,
which is great, and that's how it should be. But I think the reason why we exist is that, a lot of times it's hard to get information out of these other systems for a lot of the reasons we talked about earlier, right? Be they, structural sorts of reasons because the vendor makes it kind of hard to share data out of it, right? And, by the way, that's a way that people create lock-in and longevity, or because the security concerns or blah, 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 reasons why it's hard to do, right? And so that's where the reality sometimes becomes a bit divorced from the goal that everybody has, right? And, the simplistic version of it is, look, I've been in this industry probably too many years, and everybody talks about breaking down silos and stuff like that, right? And nobody's really fully broken down the silo yet because there's a lot of interest in keeping the silo intact, right? And so, anytime there is that silo, you wind up in the situation that we just described, right?
And the silo being like an Oracle
Sure.
ecosystem of products.
Yeah,
or
sure.
Amazon.
Or like just this, yeah, it could be Amazon, it could be Oracle, or to take it a different way, it could be like, hey, look, the credit card network always runs on these mainframes over here, right? And let's say the ATM network runs on this set of things over here, right? And so those things kind of form these little silo-y sorts of things that it's hard to share stuff between, right? And that's really more the issue here, right? It's kind of the longevity effect of prior architectural decision that it turns out people, probably spent lots of time and energy getting live and getting to work in a highly performant sort of way, and are super reticent to then say, well, what the hell, let's go off and do this other thing over here, because that just seems like a cooler thing to do, right?
Yeah. Do you get the feeling that, say, we're in the year 2022 now, 22 years after the dot-com boom, that there's and probably another 10, 15 years prior to that, where this early infrastructure of like the airline industry, maybe hotel booking systems, the credit card systems, there's a lot of infrastructure that we still use today, governmental technical systems that haven't really changed all that much, the ACH system. Do you feel we're getting to a point where those systems just aren't going to become updated, and there's going to be a superseding wave of technology, either using the fundamental attributes of decentralized blockchain or just Web 2 and more advanced either databases or security or other things? How do you view that?
I think that's right. Right. I think that is the way that it is going. And I think that, it kind of goes back to the Oracle conversation from earlier, right? Which is, I don't know that the ACH network or, the airline booking systems or whatever else, there will probably always be something that looks like what it is today. But I think what's going to happen, as you said, like these blockchain driven things or other things like that are going to add like additional options that people can elect to. And if those options become great, right, or very performant or highly secure or whatever it is, you'll wind up seeing, more and more momentum towards those things, and basically causing the more, shall we call them, legacy sorts of systems, fade by the wayside. They may be quicker, they may be slower. So I agree with you, but I really don't see a scenario where people just tomorrow say, oh, this whole ACH network, let's just take it off of whatever it is today and then just, hot cut over to this thing over here. Anytime you see that sort of stuff happen, stuff's gonna, like, I've been in this industry too long, as I've said earlier, right? Like anytime somebody hot cuts over to something, invariably, something's gonna go wrong. Somebody's going to get mad. Somebody's probably going to get fired, right? And so it's really kind of the momentum is like, hey, leave that intact while this thing grows over here, right?
Yeah, it seems like the rub is that if an entire network has to make a binary switch, as opposed to say, I lived in Boston for a year, and in Boston, they have a surprising number of police riding horses, serious police officers. And, and I'm like, oh, I have never seen that in my life, but they're serious, and they would probably gallop after somebody if they were chasing down a criminal. But because the police forces were all decentralized, they could each do really whatever they wanted. The adoption of cars into that was different. In this case, and if an entire network has to make a switch, the resistance to making the switch must be massive. You can't have like half the ACH system switch. And so I almost feel like it just, how does it ever get enough political internal momentum to switch?
Well, I don't know that it does. I think what you just said earlier is exactly the right thing. People will adopt a blockchain, Web3 sort of solution or whatever it is, right? And then people will say like, hey, I can do this ACH thing, but that opens me up to more fees perhaps, or, more security holes, or I can do this blockchain thing over here, which is like super cool and fast. And, my fees are like 1/10 of it or whatever, right? There's all these compelling reasons that over time, as long as it becomes apparent to people who are the adopters or users of those systems that this one's better, right, there'll be a migration. But to your point, there's still going to be horse riders at the end of the day, even 50 years from now, right? It'd be like, your grandfather's, ATM network. There'd be some old guy with a card, trying to stick it into an ATM. That will still happen. It just will be less common. Right?
Yeah. I'm curious to ask you more on your management experience. So you joined the company. You didn't start the company, as I understand. How big was the organization when you joined?
So I've only been here since December timeframe. So the company was, not quite 20 or right around the 20 or so mark. I was pretty much the only person who had joined that wasn't of a technical background. And that was both part of the appeal, as well as, part of the learning curve, right? It's for me to like wrap my head truly around I'm a guy who can usually figure out what a technology does at a high level and that sort of stuff. But like to do this sort of thing, you got to go a couple clicks down to understand exactly how it winds up working. So that was one of the big challenges for me. But then it was like, hey, look, this is a group of people who have built a really good product, have managed to sell a decent chunk of it without having a single person who knew how to sell anything in the organization. And then it was like, okay, well, how do we go ramp that sort of thing up? And how do we make a big appeal into the marketplace and help people really kind of understand at a simplistic level why they would want this? And that's really what the appeal to jumping on board was.
Yeah. So how did you do that? So you get in, everyone in the team is technical. You're not. This is a very technical product. It took me 15 minutes to even understand exactly what you do. And I'm still not even convinced. Do you go and sit with engineers for weeks and days and they open up terminal and pull up their code editor and just show you everything and explain? Or are there things in hindsight you would have done differently?
I think I've done this sort of play a couple times now. So, the way in which I come up to speed on a company like this is, for me, kind of fits the way that I learn. So the way I learn, I'm a classic extroverted sort of person, right? And I don't mean that as like, I say a lot of words at parties. That's not actually the point here. But the way in which I think is I digest stuff, but then I have to repeat it out or talk to people about it. And it's a lot of times in that it coming out of my mouth that it starts to make more sense for me. So firstly, and then secondly, I'm also one of these people who I like to absorb feedback very quickly. So if I say like, hey, I think it's X, I like it for people to say like, no, it's not X. Trust me, it's Y with a little special bit of Z on top of it, right? And so it's usually in that goes that gets me up to the learning curve. But the way in which we did it here is, look, I spent a bunch of time around the founder, right, who is quite technical. And we did a bunch of sessions. We did some demo sessions in terms of what it is. And the demos are great for me because I'm like, why did it do that? Or what's it doing over here? And so I get to ask like a million questions. And he was great about kind of going through it and understanding it. The second phase is then I kind of go away and I do a bunch of digging into, all right, well, what are the alternatives? Okay, so he said it did this. Why didn't it do these things? Or what is it that it would take to do these things? So a lot of kind of alternative or solution thinking, right? Trying to figure out, okay, how else would we get at this? And then, I come back and I put that list of questions to him and a couple of the other people on the team, right? And it's in that exchange that for me, that's where that extroverted thinking piece of it really comes in. We're like, oh, okay, I get it. So what I thought I meant this, there's this nuance, and those are really two different things. And so very quickly I come up to speed on that. And then for me, the final piece of like the learning process that I go through is I need to be able to, especially in my role, like if I'm to be successful, and frankly, if I'm to believe that the firm is to be successful, I need to figure out how to tell the story of the firm, right? At a high level and at enough of a level so that people who might be the potential buyers for it would say, oh, okay, I get it, right? I'm willing to ask more questions and dig in as well. And so the final part of the process for me is to really go off and construct that story and to refine it and pitch it and then take it to people who aren't necessarily affiliated with the firm and see how they respond. And if they think like, hey, well, that sounds like you're like, training goats or something like that, then you're like, okay, I totally missed, right? But if they're like, oh, okay, I think I get it, right? And back in the old days, there was this thought that I used to have, like, look, if I could explain what the firm does to my parents, right, then I was probably on the right path on the storytelling piece of it, right? Because, they're not technical and, you'd lose them at database, right? So those are the ways that I try to get to is like start super deep, look at the panoply of things that goes into it, and then be able to relay it outward. And then once people start shaking their head and saying, yeah, that makes total sense, especially the people who are kind of technical enough to know better, then you kind of got there.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. When you get in there, there's a book I read called Elephants Can Dance, where it talked about I think it was IBM's transition. I think the guy's name is Louis Gerstner. Is that right?
I forget. Yeah. It's like Gerstner or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. And he talks about, okay, you come into this is a, much different scale company, but they were, headed all down the wrong directions. And he went through this practice of, what do you do when you come in there? The CEO, you have all these VPs reporting into you. Did you go about a particular process, or did you more kind of informally slide into the position?
Yeah, so it wasn't really an informal slide into the position, right? It was one of those things where, over the course of last year, we was introduced to the founder by one of the board members, that basically were like, hey, look, we're ready. We think the technology is ready to go. We've got all these sales, right? Somebody thinks we've got a solution, right? And we'd like to figure out how to ramp up the whole thing. And for me, it was kind of this opportunity to say, okay, is this where I want to go and devote the next fill in the blank number of years? And do I think I can be successful with it and all of that sort of stuff? So that was my process on the way in. So once in, though, for me, it becomes kind of this prioritization exercise, right? What's the thing we need the most, right? What's the next most vital thing, right? And so it's this list of things that you need in order to scale it. The good news is, as I mentioned, a very technical organization with a bunch of engineers who really knew what they were doing, and very specialized sorts of talent, right? So the talent that we have on the team, these are all people who built databases in the past, which, for a lot of your listeners and viewers, right? Not everybody has built a database. In fact, if you go and look at a lot of the companies who are known for having databases, the core teams are going to be relatively small, right? Simply because databases are hard, right? And there's a bunch of attributes to it that make them very unique, right? So you need people who have kind of done it before and kind of understand what it looks like. Even though we don't technically build a database, but it kind of works like a database. We just don't have a repository or storage, if that makes sense. So the good news is I didn't have to go off and figure out a whole bunch of stuff in terms of, gee, where am I going to get engineers? We had some great ones on the team. So for the next step was like, okay, well, we need sales, right? Obviously. But, even before we have sales, we have to have marketing. We have to be able to tell the world, like if you played the Wayback Machine on the website back like November of last year, you'd probably laugh your head off, right? It was like, didn't really tell the story, didn't really, it said some words, right? But it didn't really say kind of what we did. And most people were confused when they looked at it, right? So, so number one was like, all right, so what's our outward face, right? Let's put the clothes on so people know, what our role is, right? And then from there, we need to bring in sales talent. And by the way, we also had some existing customers, so we need to make sure that they're successful. So we had to bring in people who understand how to make customers successful, because this is one of those land and expand sort of things. As soon as you start with one thing, people are like, hey, that was pretty good. Can you do that for this over here? And so if you don't make them successful, you never get to have that secondary opportunity. So that was kind of this prioritization list that we put together. And then, it's basically go off and find good leaders that you either understand what they can do and how they relate to the needs that you have, or people out of your existing network who can do the job. And so I was fortunate that I was able to draw in some people who I knew could do the job and would kill it here. And then a couple other people who I did not know before, but whose background and cultural fit were clear with what the culture of the company already was, and kind of the way in which we wanted to build it. And so, managed to get all those folks on the team. And once you get a core team together, things start to get a lot clearer, right? There's always going to be translational bits, okay, how does this person work? How does that person work? But as long as everybody has a good sense for how the pieces are supposed to fit together and what it looks like at a greater scale than where we are today, then you're likely to get some pretty good early results and some good traction.
Yeah, yeah. And when you run the team, so you have your team, your core team in there, you have a sizable tech team. Do you run, I mean, tactically, are you running like daily stand-ups? Are you running weekly reports? Are you doing, what are things that are maybe bread and butter managerial
Sure.
things that you do, and then things that might be considered unique or things that you've modified over your career?
So I definitely do a lot of standard sort of stuff. So I would describe that as kind of the management cadence of the company, right? So the company does every week, we have kind of what I would call an e-staff sort of meeting. And the e-staff sort of meeting is people giving an opportunity for the rest of the leaders of the organization to understand kind of what's changed week over week. I tend to abhor meetings where people get up and say the same crap they said last week, right? Those are not useful in my opinion. And so like I go pretty much out of my way to ask people, look, tell me what mattered this week, right? Or tell me what you were going to get done this week and you did not wind up getting done this week, and then let's talk about the reasons why, right? Because maybe we overcommitted, that happens, or maybe some dependency didn't occur, or whatever else. And it gives the management team an opportunity to say, oh, okay, this is what's troubling sales this week, or this is what engineering is grappling with, right? It's also an opportunity for people to like throw the flag and say like, hey, we said we were going to have these 5 product features that were going to come pop out, but like, one of them was harder or whatever else. And so that has an impact on the roadmap and, when stuff's going to get due and all that sort of thing. So number one, I think that's a critically important meeting to have every single week. And I go out of my way to have that, whether or not I'm out of the office or not, right? I think it's important to have it. Secondarily, I like to have one-on-ones with everybody, right? I feel like the one-on-ones are like, hey, look, if you're stuck or you're struggling or you're having other challenges or things like that, the one-on-one is really an opportunity for us to get together and put our heads together and think about, oh, okay, well, how do we solve this problem, right? Or how do we address it, or who could possibly address it?
And how many one-on-ones are you doing per week?
I'm doing, what am I doing, like 5 a week, right? So it's not too much. It's basically,
Okay.
I just generally do it with, folks who are members of that e-staff sort of thing that we're talking about there, right? And by the way, like, it really depends a little bit because it's interesting. One of the people who's on the e-staff, we have really don't have a one-on-one standing one-on-one. It's kind of like, hey, call me when you need something sort of session. And that's okay, right? Because they're kind of quick hits, right? And here I can fit them in because, oh, okay, I got 5 minutes now. Let's go talk about this now. Or like, hey, I don't have any time till 4 p.m. Let's talk about it then. And that's okay. I don't care what the format is, just as long as we're having a free-flowing exchange of data. So that's the basic cadence. Look, we do, like the monthly all-hands-y sort of thing. Where we go through and talk about big changes in the company or big plans, stuff like that. We'll talk about like, board meeting sorts of things. And I do believe very much in creating this kind of open format where there's no surprises, right? I hate surprises where, you're stringing people along and it's all good. And then one day it's not, right? That's like, it's never pleasant. So that's an important thing of it. We're starting to do, it's still early, right? So we're starting to do kind of monthly metrics reporting that we'll send out to, the shareholders or other interested parties and things like that. But that's refining over time. And that takes like a year, candidly, to get right. So those are some basic management frameworks. But like, I guess the biggest thing for me is like, you have to go off and make sure that you're hiring people that have kind of a similar transparent cultural mindset. And if you do that, and if they're all kind of in the same, sphere, then I generally feel like good things come out of it, because then going back to what I said before, there isn't this behavior where people just try to hide stuff, or, the other thing that's awful, which is like, oh, I got it until I don't, right? And then, because usually by the time you realize you don't, right, like it's horrible, versus if it, was dealt with earlier, it probably would have been just uncomfortable, right?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. It feels like you're at doing the right things for the stage of the company you're at. I like talking about the ins and outs of these things, because for me, it's evolved significantly over different startups I've run. And the only way that, I mean, these are the things that matter because these are the things that you do day in, day out, week in, week out, month over month. And they this is in large part the framework for culture. It provides the conversation points, and people talk about culture and they're like, oh, we got great culture, transparent culture. But those are just words. What is that? It has to come down to like, all right, you're going to send a message to someone in Slack. Do you do it in a private channel or a public channel? And that compounded over every conversation or every decision and how people make decisions. I think of those as like the fabric of culture. And it seems like we're moving societally towards a more transparent cultural business practice. You know, like the very closed off Apple mentality is pretty rare, at least among earlier stage startups.
I think that's right. There's going to be vestiges of it, though. Some people kind of like that environment. There are going to be people who, you know, no matter what we say, will like that. There's Look, a manifestation of it is like gossiping or other stuff like that, right? You know, or doing stuff, you know, where you're back channeling and things like that, right? I kind of go out of my way to try to stamp that out, right? You know, not here, but in prior places. I've had people come to me and like, oh, so-and-so's not doing this. And I'm like, great, go call so-and-so, right? You know, why you talking to me, right? I'm like, look, you guys can't come up with an agreement, then let's all three of us get together, right? And so, but there are people who like doing that, right? Because at some level it's easier, right? You're like, hey, I've thrown, you know, this thing to this other person over here. And some people, you know, it's uncomfortable to go to somebody and say, hey, you know, what you're doing is making my life difficult or whatever else, right? But I think as a whole, you're right. I think we are moving towards a world where more things are put out there for people to digest. And it's the right thing, right? Because my general view is if you give people a sense for what you're doing and why you're doing it, they may not 100% agree, but at least they have the context. And I at least find that they're going to be far more motivated to lean in and do the things that are needed to get whatever the goals are done if they have that background, right?
Yeah. It also, I mean, we're also at the tail end of a pandemic, which went from, I heard the number I heard was 7% of people working remote to 85% of people, which just, I mean, it's like when you talk about company gossip, it happens usually in the lunchroom. You know, people are standing there like, well, we got to talk about something, so might as well talk shit about, you know, Tony over here. Where now you have to kind of go out of your way to type that out, and you certainly don't want it in writing. Are you guys remote or partially remote or in person?
So we are totally optional. So, you know, here's the thing. So I'm like actually sitting in our offices here, and there's a couple of us that come in. For me, you know, I don't make anybody come in, by the way. I think that's really anybody's call. And some people come in a day a week and some people come in like, you know, every day a week, and that's totally fine. But we're also totally fine remote. Look, I've got people in Austin. I've got somebody in Lisbon. I've got people in Croatia, and I've got people in India, right? And so when you have that sort of a distribution, you are by definition remote at that point, right? And so that's fine for us. But I think the trick is, you know, you need to create opportunities to get everybody together because you don't want to build this us versus them or island sort of mentality. And that's really where that all hands thing, you know, we do these fun little things. We just got done with one where we called it a bug bash, right? And, you know, it was competition for who could find the most bugs and, you know, who would find the most obscure bug. And, you know, it's just little ways for people to interact with each other and, you know, playfully give each other grief or whatever. And usually that's a nice way to like build up the culture, especially when people are, you know, remote or distant at least.
Will you do a in-person, like get everyone together at some point?
I think at some point here, I think, look, I don't want to impose on anybody, like, you must come in and do this. I think it would be one of those things where, like, if people want to come in and do it, then we will. But I still think, look, I think you need to be sensitive, right? There's going to be people who are still, you know, concerned about pandemic-y sort of things. And then there's other people who are completely unconcerned about it, right? And I don't want to create this sort of environment where like, oh, hey, we're not concerned, and then ostracizing the people that are, right? And so, you know, I want to make sure that if they're, you know, if they're concerned about it, they can still participate. But, you know, as people start to become a little bit more open, or relaxed, should I say, as this pandemic thing subsides. I definitely think towards the end of the year we'll probably have some in-person stuff.
I think that attitude is quite pervasive across Silicon Valley, and from what I've seen from people working at these companies in just private conversations, is that people take advantage of that. And not implying at all that this is happening at your company. You guys are so far remote, but people at Facebook or Meta or other larger companies will say, "Hey, I don't feel comfortable," and then they're just like, they want to work at home or they want to travel and live somewhere else. And then the company doesn't know. And it's, I don't know how that changes too. It's like, well, a year from now, I still don't feel comfortable. And then what is the company going to, it's sort of interesting.
I've heard that stuff too. And I've had some odd conversations with people in like weird corners of the world who I thought were, probably down the street. So I see all of that. I think, frankly, that's the beauty of being in a small company versus necessarily being at a larger sort of company.
Yeah.
At a small company, you can't really look. It's what you do every day, every week, every year, whatever. Is pretty obvious. You can't really hide, right? You can't say, "Well, I don't want to come in and then just do nothing," right? You may be able to get away with that at a larger company because it's just harder to have those accountability sorts of things in there. But at a small company, you're like, "Hey, look, you were going to build these 4 features this month, right? And you didn't build any. What's going on?" And if you didn't build the 4 features, I don't care if you're on the moon, right? If you're being productive and you're getting the job done, go for it.
Yeah. Do you see a pathway? Let me ask it to you this way. Have you communicated internally or on the board that you can talk about a fairly clear trajectory in terms of an exit point for this company? It seems like it's in a space that there's a lot of different players.
Yeah.
It could certainly be an easy acquisition target in the short term. I know some companies are like, "Oh, we're absolutely not going to sell for 10 years." Some are like, "Well, we'll figure it out as we go." And some are...
Look, in a world where 70% of these sorts of things wind up being M&A opportunities, I think if you don't take a pragmatic approach, look, here's the way I answer that question, right? I think it's too early to tell whether or not this is a standalone opportunity versus something that winds up exiting at some point. I think the decision criteria comes in, is this a category defining opportunity? My sense is it is, right? Because at the end of the day, we're a replacement technology for ETL. We are EL and let somebody else do the T. And it's my view that there's so much complexity, we haven't talked about it here, but there's so much complexity in terms of getting information out of these data stores and a similar amount of complexity of putting them into a different data store, that it's a unique value proposition, in which case it's probably a category defining sort of opportunity. And if it is, then it can grow big enough to be a standalone sort of thing. Now, if it's not, there's plenty of opportunities or plenty of companies that we've seen exit over the last 5 years at very good valuations that I think everybody around the board and employee base would be super happy with. I just don't think we have the ability to say whether or not the timing is right to build a completely standalone entity. And we probably won't know, honestly, for another 18 or so months, right? It'll depend on the trajectory of our company. It'll depend on, kind of the customer receptivity and the rapidity with which they grow the usage of our product, and a variety of other external factors that we don't even know how it plays out yet. So that's a simple way of saying what I like to jokingly tell people, that I'm always for sale and I'm always going public until somebody gives me a compelling reason not to be one of those, right?
Yeah, I dig that. ETL is extract, transform, and load. Yeah. Is that what that stands for?
Exactly.
And that refers to a common practice in the database industry of pulling out.
Pulling data from one thing, doing something with it, and loading it into another. It's our view that, look, each of the platforms, and this comes out of the data science, machine learning sort of space that I came out of, the transformation bit of it probably is best done in the platform upon which the data is going to be consumed. And it's difficult enough to extract it out of one place and load it into the other place. So we're focusing on the EL part, and we let somebody else do the T, because the T is best done closest to the application it'll be done in, right? That's kind of our view of it.
Do you have any high-level views on how this whole, call it the whole backend infrastructure of the internet, converges? Do you see it? Are we trending in any particular direction where it's moving more decentralized, more consolidated? Or
I think it's, when you said converging, I think it's actually doing the opposite. Because in the world, ETL used to be like, oh, you do ETL, great. And now what we're seeing is this space is splitting up into a bunch of different players. You're seeing people who do, I call it data mobility, but it's the extract and load piece of it. You see people who are doing like the transformational pieces of it, so like DBT labs, all the stuff like that. That's going to be a whole separate entity. They're probably not going to want to do what we do. There's this whole observability space, right, where you're trying to figure out, hey, are things still working the way they're supposed to work or whatever else. And so what I actually see happening here is that 10 years ago, we all got on this bandwagon and said data is the new gold or oil or whatever you want to call it, right? And people paid a lot of lip service to that, but it still was this, hard to understand, hard to get, hard to manipulate sort of thing, right? Whereas now, what I think people have realized is, okay, so it's a complex beast, right? There's all these different things that need to happen in order to make it useful to the people on either end. So it probably shouldn't be in the hands of one particular company because it's just too complex, right? So if I think about the people that I would hire to do what we do, and then I think about the people that I would hire to do the transformation piece or the observer, there are three different groups of people, right? And so there's not too many companies out there who can specialize in two or even three things at once. So I think by nature, it's going to disaggregate into particular sets of utility. And I think the users or the adopters of those things are going to adopt them based on, they may be more or less inclined to adopt a certain piece of it based on their internal capabilities, the complexities of the data, the vagaries of the use cases that they will use it with, and all of those sorts of things. So I think and that's a good news, right? Because then people have choice. People can figure out, oh, okay, I like this, but I like this thing over here, and let's put those things together.
And when you say people, you mean the
adopters, like the devs, whoever it is that's going to do stuff.
Right, of the companies. And when you think of the data, the world of the data being gold, do you think of it as in these, you said silos, this is a good word for it, like companies. So Amazon has a finite set of data points that they collect from all their users. They can show ads, they can introduce new products. Same with Meta, same with Google. And then there's also the Wild West outside of that, like ad networks and everything else. Do you see how do you see those interacting, where the market share of large companies kind of gets bigger as they get access to more and more data and aggregate it in useful ways?
I'd break it apart into two different things, right? I think like the world of like the large school tech companies like the Metas or the Googles or the Amazons, they're such different beasts than everybody else. The world I kind of think about are like, the banks, the insurance companies, the retail organizations, the other things. They have a lot of interesting data. They don't have quite the scale of data that the Googles or the Metas might have, right? I mean, the interaction data that they have from users of those platforms is immense, and it's not going to be shared. It's not like Google's going to be like, oh, okay, let me just show you everything I've got on all my people, and you can go and consume, because that's kind of their bread and butter, right? Whereas what I'm thinking about is, look, there's plenty of good information that goes to banks about their customers and the way in which they use stuff and how they use stuff and all of that sort of stuff. And so those are the people that I think are going to be best served by technologies such as ours and this other ecosystem that's evolving, I should say. I think the world of the Googles, they'll continue to try to do things that maximize their value and, increase the amount of data that they apply to their individual users. But I think those are different beasts, right?
Yeah. All the banks, all the retail outlets have been, I would imagine, pretty inefficient with their use of data. Like, what do they collect? Emails? They send out an email newsletter. Maybe that's about it.
Well, they collect more than you might think. And that's actually the interesting thing, right? And that's actually kind of the hallmark of what we're trying to do, right? Which is, just collecting, like, hey, I used an ATM today in San Mateo, and maybe yesterday I used one in LA, right? So now you know that I've been mobile and I tend to travel a lot or whatever else. So I'm getting information on that. And then I have, maybe I've got 5 different accounts, right? And, maybe my savings account balance is a little low or a little high, or, there's all these interesting things that go along with it that could give you a better sense for like, hey, this customer is really, this is what their profile is, or how we could serve them better, or how we can do things to increase engagement with them or whatnot, right? So they actually have more than you might think. And so, really what we're all about is like giving them access to all the different areas where they may intersect with somebody so that they can then maximize the value of that data in serving, those customers or, whatever, like increasing their security profile, what have you.
Yeah. And that seems to be the cash value of like digital data gold, right? It's like, it all boils down to the conscious experience of people is like, hey, what ad are you going to show me on this app? Yeah. How much, if you had all the data in the world, you could show me the perfect ad, the thing that I would be most interested and most likely to click and buy. And then, multiply that philosophy by every product or service you use. If they knew everything about you, they could offer you the best possible experience. Of course, there's a trap with that, of giving every company all the data about you. But it seems like maybe it's a pendulum that kind of has to swing where we're like, okay, give all these companies the most they could possibly have so they give us the best experience, which is what I want as a consumer. Yeah. Then we get bit on the other end where data leaks. I don't know exactly what the other end would be.
Well, so I think you're right. There is kind of a range that you can go in. There's kind of, I would just find it as an ethical range, right? I think you're right. The way it should work is that like these companies take all sorts of data about you or me or whatever, right? And use it to maximize our experience, right? If you maximize an individual's experience, they'll be like, hey, that was pretty good. I'd like to do more with them, right? And so that then helps, the company that's provided that. I think if you get into weirder situations where people are going to start doing privacy invasive sort of stuff or other things like that, I personally kind of frown on that sort of thing, right? And I don't know a lot of companies. I intersected with a lot of companies over the last couple of years who are trying to figure out how to serve their customers better, not figure out, like weird things about them or other stuff like that, right? So I think I'm hopeful that the long-term trend here is that companies want to know more so they can do better. I think the secondary piece of it is, there's definitely a security aspect of this to the second part of your question, which is, everybody's got to figure out a way to make sure that they're safeguarding that sort of information, because the worst possible thing is to allow, untoward actors basically the ability to get at things that otherwise should not be in the public sphere, right? And so, yes, the people do need to take extra measures to make sure they're not doing untoward things.
What happens if that happens? So say Uber leaked all their data, or what if half the retailers leaked all their data? Would there be any substantial impact on people's lives?
I don't know exactly how this would work. I think, frankly, you do see lots of instances where people are having to go off and deal with adverse credit impacts, right? Because somebody managed to grab social security numbers,
identity theft,
or somebody impersonated me or whatever else. That would certainly be adverse. Right. I think, most of the data breaches today, bits and pieces get sold off on the black market. Right. And then the breached companies are paying for credit monitoring for 2 years or 3 years, which is, everybody hates that sort of stuff. And, I don't like it either. My hope is that's as bad as it would wind up getting. But I could certainly see a scenario where if the wrong sort of information were out there, a lot of the questions that, when you go to applications that are like, what was your first pet's name or whatever else, right? And it's so if that sort of stuff gets out there, it becomes ever increasingly difficult to then, secure particular accounts, because a lot of those questions are kind of common across platforms, right? And so it'd be really easy for somebody to be able to totally impersonate us.
Yeah. I'm with you. It's fascinating to think about. It's like, well, even then, the only reason why my pet's name is relevant is because banks tend to ask the same 7 questions.
Exactly.
What's your mom's maiden name? What street did you grow up on?
Well, because it's interesting because there's a tolerance. So people are like, I don't want to have to think too much about this, right? So people are happy with those 7 questions, right?
I know. As soon as they ask me some obscure question like where did your dad go to high school? Something I'm like, I don't.
You're like,
I don't know.
Who the hell knows? Yeah, exactly.
Anything I didn't ask you that you wanted to add in? We certainly give a shout out to the company's site. I think the site looks beautiful, by the way. Nice. I don't know if this is a redesign from certainly what you used to have, but
it's Rita Zenny, who we brought on to run marketing, has done just an amazing job. So I will let her know, but I appreciate you saying that. Thank you.
Nice. And are you active on social media? Personally?
Not particularly. I sadly, between running a company and like having, 2, high school age boys into sports, which makes me like stressed out from work and a bus driver after hours. I don't have a whole lot of time to do too much social media sort of stuff. I'll do the LinkedIn thing, but that's kind of the extent of it at this point.
Cool, man. Well, Gary, thanks so much.
Awesome. Well, it's been a real pleasure, Mike. Thanks very much for having me. And I'll look forward to chatting with you down the road.
Yeah, sounds good. Keep crushing it, man.
Awesome. Sounds good. All right.